Excellent. Thanks so much, Boykin. And thanks to everybody for joining us this morning. I hope you're all cozy and warm at home or wherever you happen to be. I'm glad that we made the decision last week to go ahead and make this a Zoom meeting, because that way everybody's safe where they are and nobody's rushing to get anywhere, because this is really going to be a great conversation. And I'm just really thrilled that we can move forward with it. Now, I want to introduce to you Dr. Patrick T. Smith, who is Associate Research Professor of Theological Ethics and Bioethics at Duke Divinity School, my alma mater, and Senior Fellow at the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. His PhD in philosophy comes from Wayne State University in what is truly the great state of Michigan. He was named the 2016-2017 Henry Luce III Fellow in Theology and was the recipient of the 2019 Paul Ramsey Award for Excellence in Bioethics. Along with his work at Duke Divinity School, he is the Director of Bioethics for the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine, and Associate Professor in Population Health Sciences at Duke Medical School. Serves as the faculty director for the Advanced Care Planning and Healthy Learning Through Faith program, which works to strengthen the capacity of the African American Advanced Care Planning and Palliative Care Network to develop a community of clinicians, clergy, and scholars who collaborate to improve the health and healthcare experiences of African Americans throughout their lives, with particular attention to the end of life. And as the faculty director for that, he is managing a very large grant that came in just in December, I believe. So many congratulations to Dr. Smith for that. And having said all of that, it's clear that we're going to need to ask him to come back for a second session to talk to us about bioethics sometime. Because today we've invited him here to speak about yet another area of research and expertise, the theology and ethics of Martin Luther King Jr. And this is how I actually know Dr. Smith. Believe it or not, with all that he's doing in the medical school and with bioethics, he still somehow has time to teach ethics and theology courses at Duke Divinity School. And a couple of years ago, I had the great privilege of taking a class with Dr. Smith on the theology and ethics of Martin Luther King Jr., which is why he came to mind immediately when we started planning this course. This is the first in a three-part series that we're calling Personhood and Power, Studies in Black Theology from Martin Luther King Jr. to James Cone. And so today we're looking forward to having a conversation, Dr. Smith and I, and those of you also who have some questions on the theology of Martin Luther King, and especially his idea of personhood. So all that being said, it's my privilege to welcome Dr. Smith. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Pastor Philip, for having me. I was so excited when I saw your invitation and looking forward to being with all of you on this very snowy Sunday morning, but hope, as Pastor Philip said, a cozy, warm Sunday morning from wherever you are joining us here. So I'm so excited to be with you all.
Excellent. Well, so as I mentioned before, the first part of this conversation, Dr. Smith and I are going to chat and ask some questions, I think, of each other and delve into some of the texts that we may have read together from Martin Luther King Jr. I'm going to show you all a couple of books that I have here with me. And one of them is called Stride Towards Freedom. This is a Beacon Press edition from 2010, I believe. This is King's account of the events leading up to and extending from the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 and the years around that. And then I also have a book called Testament of Hope, which is really a wonderful volume. And if anybody's looking for kind of a volume to start with, to read from Martin Luther King Jr., A Testament of Hope, The Essential Writings of Martin Luther King Jr. That just has so many different documents, really pivotal documents, and much of what we'll be reading and thinking about can be found in there. The overarching question that we've got for our conversation, and really that sets off the series, is related to a phrase that you find often in King's writing, and that's that King says that within and leading up to the civil rights movement, Black people had come to recognize, I am somebody as a phrase that appears again and again. And so we're going to think about where this statement about personhood comes from and where it leads. And so my first question for Dr. Smith is just what threads from King's theological and philosophical training contribute to this emphasis on somebodyness that shows up so often in King's thought?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think a wonderful way to get started. This, and if you type it in, if you're working a Word document, this idea of somebodyness, right? The little red lines will show up. It's like, well, what is this, right? But there was this deep notion of somebodyness that was actually deeply embedded in the really the religious spiritual tradition that actually produced Martin Luther King Jr. And so there, some historians have tried to divide at least the civil rights movement as it is seen in the late 50s up through the late 60s, which many would suggest the civil rights movement goes much further back, right? People like, obviously Frederick Douglass and so many others, right, doing this work as precursors at different phases. And so we think about the American civil rights movement in terms of late 50s, 60s. And so there was this first phase, so to speak, a kind of a reclaiming, if you will, of this deep sense of dignity, especially in the Jim Crow South, right? Where the very political and social structures were set up to uplift a kind of white superiority and a Black inferiority. And what happens is that when you have a socio-political context, right, a social context that has that kind of social hierarchy, right, along racialized lines that certainly have economic exploitation and political marginalization aspects to it, it's hard to be in those kinds of settings when you actually have the power of kind of state-sanctioned violence to uphold those kinds of social structures, to have a kind of socialization process that is taking place, right? Such that not only do you see these kinds of issues of racism at this kind of, some would say, institutional or societal or cultural level, it is certainly interpersonal, right, between certain groups of people, but then racism can also be internalized, right? Meaning that you begin to believe what it is that people are saying about you, whether if one is, considered in part of this dominant group, right? Or say like white people in terms of questions of superiority, or people of color of various, stripes, right? Of inferiority. And so part of what King was doing there was reclaiming something that was deeply embedded in this kind of African-American Christian spirituality that nurtured him, to reaffirm a sense of you are loved by God, right? That you are an image bearer and you have a kind of dignity in worth. And so this idea of somebodyness was a reminder of people to be radical. And what that word radical means there, sometimes it scares people when you think about it, but I'm thinking about it in terms of the original use of the word, right? Radical meaning rootedness, going back to the source or the root. And what King was doing, this radical vision, was saying, go back to the roots, right, of who we are in God, and that kind of dignity. And that was rooted, he often would emphasize, in this notion of the imago Dei, or that's just another way of saying the image of God that is found in every human being.
So you mentioned one of I think the key words that shows up when King is referring to this kind of heritage about personhood or somebodyness, and that's dignity. Mm-hmm. What other words go along with that for King that indicate he's trying to recover, he's pointing to the recovery of a sense of deep personhood or somebodyness?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because for King, so personhood language shows up in different ways in different traditions, right? You mentioned in your very kind and gracious introduction earlier, some of the work I do in bioethics are in healthcare ethics. And sometimes people use the language of dignity and they use the language of personhood. Sometimes they use that language to say, to root personhood in like certain cognitive faculties or abilities, meaning that we're able to reason a particular way, such that there's this language that sometimes is used that, well, this person has lost their personhood, right? There's a particular account, right, of that. But King had something very different in mind, right? Based on this, he had a particular philosophical system, right, in which he was kind of thinking about that in terms of his academic training that informed, kind of this notion of personhood. But it goes back to the fact that God is a personal God, that God is actively involved in human beings. And this notion of personhood was this kind of divine connection, if you will, for King to this notion of God and something of deep value. So it was not so much in the ability for people to reason in a particular way, such that if they have any type of cognitive disabilities, that their value is somehow undermined, which is the case with some contemporary philosophical ways of thinking about personhood. But for King, it was deeply tied to this notion of dignity as something that is intrinsic to human beings, regardless of one's ability, one's race, one's socioeconomic status, so on and so forth. And it is interesting because King often emphasized this notion of, and we'll probably come to this as well, Reverend Philip, about, like beloved community. But for King, there was never this sense of personhood being this kind of rugged individualism, right? King rejected that, and a lot of language around personhood in our contemporary setting is often emphasizing this kind of individual nature to it. But for King, persons were always going to be persons in community, right? There's no way to think about persons without persons in community. So you'll see this phrase, persons dash in dash community, right? To show that it's not a collectivism, right? Such that individuals don't matter. It's not that kind of collectivism. Nor is it a rugged individualism that human beings can be detached from the larger community, but it's persons in community always held together in tandem with all the tension that comes along with that. And it is interesting that the Greek word, right, that shows up in New Testament language of person is prosopon, right? And what that basically means is the etymology of the word is this kind of pros, kind of turning towards, and then this notion of the eye or face, right, or the other. And so really person in this Greek concept is turning towards another. Now, isn't that beautiful, right? In some ways, if you think about this notion of persons in community, this value of rooted personhood in God, meaning turning to another, right? This deep notion of persons in community, which symbolizes this deep sense of value that all human beings have.
So you mentioned that the importance of persons and personality in part comes from some of King's training, his PhD training, I believe, in a school of thought called personalism, which was something that was really fascinating to me, that you walked us through when I was in that class with you. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. And I'm going to look up a passage from Stride Towards Freedom, where he explains that a little bit more. But can you say a little bit about his academic training and what that, how that contributed to his emphasis on somebodiness or personhood?
Yeah. So for King, it's interesting. Scholars at one point, really emphasized his academic training. Who were some of the theologians and philosophers that he read and, kind of influenced his thinking. So there was a lot of early work done looking at those sources, and that is certainly true and certainly informative in many ways. Then other scholars, as they continue to dig more deeply and even looking at King's writings and a lot of his autobiographical essays, recognized that it was this kind of formation of what was considered like the Black church tradition that deeply formed King's values, so that when he did his academic training, he was looking for various philosophical and conceptual and theological resources to help him explain some of these values, or to give him some language that he could use in conversation and debate and argument, and also crafting and posing policy or recommending policy to be adopted to move towards a greater sense of justice from a starting point of racial and economic injustice, right? And so some people have been concerned, like, well, King just seemed to be cherry picking, right, from this person, that person, and he doesn't seem to situate his school of thought. Well, that misses something very important about King's work and the way he was leveraging these various academic resources, because of the deep formation that is rooted in kind of an African-American Christian spirituality. And so for King, personalism that he was exposed to in some of his academic training resonated so deeply with him, because at the heart of philosophy of personalism is a rejection of a kind of a world that is kind of a purely natural world, right? Or that everything can be reduced to nature, right? Or a different form of materialism. So in philosophical language, Pastor Philip, right? Some will say, well, it's a kind of a version of idealism, which basically says the fundamental reality of the world or the universe that we live in is not material stuff, but it's personality. Right now, there are various ways that the school of personalism has fleshed itself out. So there are some who aren't theistic, meaning that believe in kind of a personal God that is often characterized in kind of monotheistic Western traditions like Judaism, Islam, Christianity. And then there are theistic versions of personalism. And certainly King was going to situate himself as a theistic personalist that basically says the fundamental value or ground of ultimate reality of all that there is rooted in persons. And so then if human beings are also persons, right, then again, that is a way of elevating the value of human beings, not to the exclusion of everything else, right? But certainly as part of this notion of how human communities should be formed and uplifted and highlighted. So does that get a little bit at kind of
Absolutely.
where you wanted to go with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So for those of you who may have or are interested in getting this book, Stride Towards Freedom, it's hard to get it on camera. There's a chapter here called Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. It's chapter 6. And King walks through some of his own personal formation. And so here's a paragraph from page 88 on personalism. And what he says reflects so much of what Dr. Smith just said. Personalism's insistence that only personality, finite and infinite, is ultimately real, strengthened me in 2 convictions. It gave me metaphysical and philosophical grounding for the idea of a personal God. And it gave me a metaphysical basis for the dignity and worth of all human personality. I think that so well reflects what Dr. Smith just said, that this is a philosophical framework for what King already senses and knows to be true from Christian theology, which has that language of persons, divine persons in it, and then human personality or personhood reflecting the Imago Dei. And it connects with dignity. This is, again, a philosophical basis for this argument for dignity that comes out, especially as he starts thinking about protest.
And Pastor Philip, I just want to say something about the dignity. And, there are different ways of thinking about, this dignity language, right? Some will say that there is a kind of variable sense and an invariable sense, right? Because sometimes people talk about, where you're treating that person as if you're taking away their dignity. Or someone may say, this situation has stripped me of my dignity. And so there's a way of talking about dignity that seems to suggest that, dignity is something that can be given and taken away, right, in certain ways, right? We use that language. And then there are other times in which we talk about dignity as something that people have insofar as they are people, right? And that people matter to God. And so oftentimes people say, well, dignity is a problematic concept because people are using it in such contradictory ways. Well, I think the reality is that we can just distinguish between various senses of the word dignity. And so there's a variable sense of dignity and an invariable sense of dignity. The variable sense is when we use it, when we talk about certain things where certain individuals, maybe an athlete competes and wins some prize or some award, and you say whether you're bestowing a kind of dignity upon them in that particular role, or you're treating someone as less than human. And basically that's just another way of saying that you're treating them as if they did not have dignity, or you're treating them in undignified ways, right? And there's this invariable sense that says that no, dignity is rooted in who we are as people. Now, there's a lot of debate as to what grounds that dignity, right? Is it something theological? Is it philosophical? Is it a commitment to some type of humanism, right? Whatever the case may be, those debates, people have had, and we can certainly have. The point is that the invariable sense is saying, even if people are being treated in humane ways, what makes it even more atrocious is the fact that they do have dignity, and they're being treated in ways as if they did not have that dignity that's fundamental to their very way of being. And so this language is important for King, right? The dignity language, because he has to be able to make this appeal and root it in people as they are, who they are, regardless of any of these other characteristics that we have oftentimes, used to marginalize some and uplift others to the detriment of the whole community.
So with this kind of ground layer, this foundation about the dignity inherent in human personhood, how does this get fleshed out when it comes to the actions that King is part of and that he leads? And specifically thinking about the protest movements that he leads, how is dignity or somebodiness reflected in the type of protest, the extent and the limits of protest that King endorses and leads?
Yeah. So for King, this deep sense of dignity, worth, or value, in different speeches, King would say something to the effect of this: it's hard for people to ride your back when you stand up straight. It's hard for people to ride your back when you stand up straight. When you have this deep sense of knowing who you are and the value that you have and the kind of agency that has been given to human beings by God, then understanding that sense of dignity and who we are, and I would say in a theological context, and more importantly, in whose we are, requires that human beings stand up to say no to injustice, to say no to inhumanity, to say no to that kind of oppression and marginalization. And this is one of the interesting things about Jesus. I think some of you may be familiar with Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, right? And so, Jesus that Howard Thurman describes is one who stands with those whose backs are against the wall, the disinherited, the disenfranchised, the disempowered, right? And so for King, this deep notion who Thurman certainly influenced King in significant ways. And so this Jesus who stands with those whose backs are against the wall, this deep sense of dignity, encourages people to stand up and to say no, right, to this particular violence. Now for King, as he is informed by the Jesus tradition, all right, his Christian tradition, and also as he looked at the methodology of somebody like Gandhi in terms of this method of nonviolence, he was committed to the fact that the protest that he engaged in, it had to be direct action. It's not passive, right, anyway, for King. And so King really pushed back on his critics to say, well, okay, well, you're just advocating some type of passivity. He says, no, it has to be aggressive, direct action but he was committed to nonviolence because he was committed to the personhood of all of humanity. And so for him, there was a deep consistency there. So that is what would motivate people, right? To move them to stand up for themselves, but to also try to address the evils that they see, and not so much to just completely denigrate or harm the evildoers. Okay. And so for King, he wanted to make that distinction. Now, that distinction is really hard, right? In many ways. I mean, it is hard. And I think if anybody is not honest with the reality of King's ethic and the theological categories, I think I think that's a problem that we have to wrestle with. What are the real implications of this? And are these, distinctions without a difference, or do these distinctions really matter? And it elevates what it means to follow Jesus, right? If King is getting this from Jesus. So the limits of this for King is going to be this notion of non-violent resistance, but it has to be deeply aggressive. Now, in full disclosure, many other researchers and thinkers and theologians and philosophers, political theorists, and historians who've looked at King's philosophy of nonviolence, which he was deeply committed to, would often observe that his commitment to nonviolence and the impact that it had, at least at certain stages, would not have been nearly as effective without the threat of violence in other sectors, right? Meaning that it wasn't so much an advocating of kind of a form of self-defense, but there were other groups that were saying, look, King, how do we defend our families, right? If people are coming armed to run us off of our property, how in the world can we not engage in a form of self-defense? And what too often happens is that whenever this question of violence, nonviolence comes up, is often expressions of violence in terms of, well, African Americans or, Black Americans, well, they should be nonviolent. But oftentimes the conversation is not focused on what about the violence that's being done towards those communities, right? And then the other part of this conversation is that oftentimes when there have been people who advocated the use of violence in forms of self-defense, it was flipped and say, well, you're advocating kind of a political violence. And they're saying, no, we're advocating the same things that everybody else is advocating, just that others have taken up arms in order to defend themselves. Why can't we, right? So there was a lot of internal debate here, and King felt that pressure, right? Obviously. And then there were some places where he says, look, yes, we can defend our homes and those kinds of things, but in terms of our larger public protest, as we're trying to seek a kind of political freedom, he was committed to nonviolence because of his other kind of ethical and theological commitments. Okay, so that's kind of what constrained King in a particular way. So nonviolence was not only a methodology that he wanted to employ, but for King, it was also a philosophy of life. And not everyone in the Black freedom struggle shared it in those two ways. They may have embraced it as a methodology because they thought pragmatically it was the best way forward, and they may not have been committed to it as a way of life. And oftentimes what they would say is that don't judge us too harshly, right? Because if we were to flip it over, how many of our counterparts would actually say that they believe in nonviolence in terms of even in the form of self-defense or abdicating self-defense, right, as well? So in other words, they were very quick to suggest that they should not be judged negatively for advocating the same things that any other community will advocate for themselves.
One of the phrases that sticks out to me, and I think we'll bring this up again next week, is that when King talks about the strategies and the methods of nonviolent protest, and especially when he's talking about what he learned from Gandhi, he calls nonviolent protest the weapon of love. And it's this wonderful MLK phrase that, this really memorable phrase that balances some paradox, weapon and love. Yeah. And another phrase he so often uses is that nonviolent resistance does resist. It's an active thing and not a passive thing, which I think he's often using to talk to his critics, within the freedom struggle, not just folks on the other side of the line, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right. He was certainly saying, look, we have to resist, we have to fight, we have to struggle. But it was a reminder that he was trying to suggest that we fight not against flesh and blood, right? But against principalities and powers in high places and spiritual wickedness, right? So there was a deep spirituality for King, but it, yes, manifested itself in lived, embodied material conditions. So he couldn't just deal with the spiritual aspect of these things without dealing with the real material conditions in which people find their lives being negatively affected. Yeah.
I'm just going to point to another part of the book, Stride for Freedom, for those who are interested in seeing where this comes out really strongly and clearly in King's writing. This is a fantastic chapter. This is from chapter 4, titled The Day of Days, December 5th. And King is really a wonderful storyteller, and this is his story of this pivotal day, the first day of the Montgomery bus boycott, where the leaders of this movement are kind of nervous to figure out, is this going to work? Are people going to stay home or not ride the bus? Or are they going to, take other ways to work? So this day starts off with King kind of watching the bus stop and delighting at seeing these empty buses. And it ends at this pivotal meeting at a church where he gives this, impassioned and famous speech. But he's not really sure, what he's going to say. And it turns out that he's only got 20 minutes to write this, most important speech of his life so far. There's something that's kind of joyfully familiar to somebody who's written and given sermons on this too, where you've got big plans about how you're going to form the speech. So it's a great story, but then he talks about what he actually says in the speech. And so this is from page 48. King says, as he's giving this speech, I decided that I had to face the challenge head on and attempt to combine two apparent irreconcilables: the need to be militant and standing up against injustice, and also the need to be Christian and nonviolent. I would seek to arouse the group to action by insisting that their self-respect was at stake, and that if they accepted such injustices without protesting, they would betray their own sense of dignity and the eternal edicts of God himself. But I would balance this with a strong affirmation of the Christian doctrine of love. So he's balancing the two, dignity and love, and both of those reflect each other. So that's from page 48 from Stride for Freedom. So Dr. Smith, you mentioned a little bit earlier where this is heading for King, this concept of beloved community. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on that and its place in King's ethics, and this conversation about and personality.
Yeah, I know that notion of beloved community, many people are familiar, comes from other, philosophers and religious thinkers, Josiah Royce, right? Others, talked about this notion of a beloved community. And really it's this idea of a community of persons. Now for King, obviously extends geographically, right, in different ways, but really this idea in terms of localized communities, in particular geographical spaces that have been formed and held together by a particular notion of love, right, which he would claim as agape, right? And I'll come back to that in just a second here. Remind me to come back to it if I forget to do so, Philip here. And so this notion of community, but it's a community in which it's not a kind of ideal utopian, right, where it's as if we were to think about Christian tradition, we'll think about the ultimate fulfillment of the kingdom of God or something on that line, or the reign of God, as we often talk about in some of our ecclesial spaces. But it's really an aspirational sense of what it means to engage in what some would call penultimate flourishing, right? Or that kind of flourishing of the in-between state of the already coming of the reign of God in the person of Jesus, according to some of my theological commitments, right? But in the not yet of the fulfillment of the reign of God that Christian tradition would affirm that is yet to take place. And so what does it mean to flourish in a penultimate sense, not ultimate sense, but a penultimate sense, in this in-between state? And so there's this idea of recognizing that if there are going to be these, different types of conflicts, that those can be handled judiciously and fairly, that the burdens and the benefits of our larger social world are equally shared, that not one group always has to bear the brunt or take the loss of trying to figure out what it means to do life together and bump into one another, where there is access to the resources of God's good creation, right? Psalm, was it 24? The earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, right? But yet you see certain individuals and groups, a small minority of folks who seem to hoard and commodify all the resources of the earth, and how that undermines this genuine notion of community and flourishing. So for King, it was just this sense of, to put it in academic terms, all rightness. Right? That things are all right, in terms of the way that we relate to each other. Now, so for King, this notion of beloved community deeply emphasizes this notion of love, because for him, there are different ways to kind of keep, right, or preserve is the word I'm looking for, community, right? Sometimes violence can preserve community. If you have a community, there's a threat to the community, violent engagement, right, or whatever the case may be. Or some people can think about reconciliation, right, which means to come back together again, presupposing that there was some type of connection. The challenge, though, for King in terms of the Black freedom struggle in the United States is, how does reconciliation work when there was never really a togetherness to begin with? So the question for King was, how do you form community where there previously was none, right? That's the question. It's like, yeah, we can preserve community in all kinds of ways, but how do you actually, really create community where there previously was none? What does that even look like, right? And so for King, this notion of agape was, now again, people, and I have some concerns with this particular term as well, but one has to understand what King means by this. He talks about love as disinterested love of neighbor. In other words, love of them for their own sake. Now, some say disinterested, it almost seems like apathy, right? I'm not really interested in you as a person. That can be a way that people could think about it, and it does have that connotation, but that would misconstrue exactly what King meant by that, as he was relying on someone like Paul Ramsey in his Basic Christian Ethics book, right? Disinterested love of neighbor is basically saying that I am going to seek to love the other regardless if there is a kind of reciprocity in the relationship, right? So my loving someone else is not dependent on their loving me, or my treating them right is not dependent upon them treating me right, right? Because for King, he was deeply concerned, if nothing like agape breaks in, we're just going to continue to have strife and incivility, and it'll be power plays, and ultimately all of us will be dehumanized. Because again, remember King's personalism that was informed by his Christian theology, that this is not the way that God intended for human beings to be in community with one another and to flourish. And even if people have a sense of superiority and have a social arrangements that is set up that way, that's still dehumanizing to them, because in God's cosmos, in God's divine intention, in God's yes, that is not the way people are supposed to be. And that's always going to leave individuals wanting whenever we try to define ourselves over against other groups. Why? Because these other groups will always have ways of shaking what it is that we think is most fundamental about those relationships, and it creates an existential identity crisis for those who deem themselves to be superior, right? Such that you either have to ignore those gains, explain them away, or squash them in order to preserve something that you think gives you value, worth, and dignity, instead of finding the value, worth, and dignity in God's divine yes towards human beings, right? And so for King, this notion of beloved community, Pastor Philip, becomes really important to generate a kind of relational way of being that can lend itself towards a kind of penultimate flourishing in this world.
I'm glad you mentioned the term agape. For those following in Stride Towards Freedom, that's also a term, and King explains some of its sources for him in that chapter, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. This shows up in so many places, but it also shows up in one of those chapters we mentioned earlier from Testament of Hope. So I'll just read a short passage from this is a chapter called An Experiment in Love. And so on page 19 of Testament and Hope, King says exactly what Dr. Smith says. Agape is disinterested love. It is a love which the individual seeks not his own good, but the good of the neighbor. Agape does not begin by discriminating between worthy and unworthy people or any qualities that people possess. It begins by loving others for their sakes. It is an entirely neighbor-regarding concern for others. Therefore, agape makes no distinction between friends and enemy. Goes on to say, consequently, the best way to assure oneself that love is disinterested is to have love for the enemy neighbor, from whom you can expect no good in return, but only hostility and persecution. But then from what you've said, Dr. Smith, the hope is that in showing the enemy neighbor, as King describes them, that agape, that disinterested love, you, the target of violence, have taken a potential step towards beloved community.
Yeah, that's right. And because it's for King, it's a sense of saying, look, someone has to step up and make such an expression. And the idea that King was wrestling with, and this has been deeply criticized, right? Part of King's philosophy and his ethics, right? Has been deeply criticized, right? It was a particular moral psychology that was at work for King, right? Because it was like, look, I mean, we have to let others know that we are not trying to defeat them, right? Or that we're not trying to humiliate them, that we're not trying to, wipe them completely off of the scene. Presumably, is twofold, right? I think there was a theoretical and a practical reason for King, right? In terms of my understanding, my thought, theoretically, right? Because again, he was committed to this notion of the Imago Dei, to personalism that deeply informed his way of thinking. But then he also recognized human behavior, right? Human beings, such that if people thought that, look, you're trying to take me off of the scene here, or you're trying to humiliate me, then there's going to be even a deeper resistance where people will not attend to the basic humanity of all who are involved here. And one of the things that many others who are wrestling with this, right, is just saying, look, at some point, we have to be careful of the kinds of sacrifices that oppressed groups are being called upon to do. And so what others have said, and King was also emphasizing this as well at later times, in his work, was just, this is not just an ethic for Black people, right, in the freedom struggle. This is an ethic for everyone, right? So then the question becomes, what does it look like to take King's philosophy of nonviolence and King's philosophy of agape love and the sacrifice that it entails? And as you know, in that particular essay, I think that you're reading from, An Experiment of Love, is like towards the end there, when he talks about a commitment to love, he gives 5 different criteria, 6 different criteria, something like that, about what that love looks like, if I'm remembering correctly, Philip. And so the question is, what would that look like? How would things change if that particular ethic was embraced by the dominant group in towards with regard to the interaction with, let's say, at that time, like the Black freedom struggle, and even the way you see different freedom struggles working themselves out in our contemporary context, right? So I think there's something very interesting and fascinating about that whole dynamic there.
Yeah, just looking at what becomes his, this looks like it's his 5th point, his penultimate point on what agape means. He says, agape means a recognition of the fact that all life is interrelated. To the degree that I harm my brother, no matter what he is doing to me, to that extent I am harming myself. For example, white men often refuse federal aid to education in order to avoid giving the Negro his rights. Because all men are brothers, they cannot deny Negro children without harming their own. They end all efforts to the contrary by hurting themselves. So I think that reflects some of what you were saying, where King is saying everyone needs to reflect this kind of disinterested and generous love, even the dominant classes, right? Or it's a kind of self-induced harm, whether that's recognized or not.
And you know, Pastor Philip, the big challenge for us, I think, in our contemporary mindset in wrestling with this particular issue is, do we really believe that, right? Do we really believe in this kind of deep sense of interdependence, or this deep sense of mutuality, right? You know, as King would often say, we're caught in this inescapable network of mutuality, right? That our well-being is deeply tied to the well-being of others. And so one of the fundamental questions, right, that we have to continue to ask ourselves is, do we really believe that is true?
I would love to open up so that other folks can ask Dr. Smith some questions. If you're all right with that, Dr. Smith, let's see what questions other folks who have been listening along might have.
Philip, you're muted, and it looks like, let's see, Carol Marshall has her hand up, but she'll need to unmute.
Thanks, boy.
Dr. Smith, I'm curious, with the background that you have laid, well, and Philip as well, that you've laid before us, how our current philosophy and way of life of stark individualism can be dealt with in a meaningful way, such that we move towards a beloved community.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carol, for that question, and I certainly appreciate your taking time to be here this morning. I think the way that I would respond is by figuring out who do we mean when we talk about the hour, right? We mentioned about our, kind of context, because we know that all of us are part of like bigger communities, smaller communities. Some of those communities that we're, different communities we're part of sometimes, are in conflict with each other, but yet we're all part of those same communities, right, in different ways. And so what does this mean? And I would just say, from the perspective of, for those who have been shaped and formed by Christian tradition, say, that attending to the person of Jesus really can help us begin to think in ways that can reshape a kind of rugged, autonomous individualism run amok in our, kind of contemporary setting. Because when we look at the life of Jesus, really, and one of the things we learn, I think, through theological anthropology, that what does it mean to be human in some ways, right? A lot of things we could say, right? So a huge question, right? But some things one thing we can say is that it means being for others, right? And why do we say that, right? But when you look at the person of Jesus, remember the biblical language, right, says that all human beings are made in the image of God, yes, or according to the image of God. But think about when it's talking about Jesus, what does it say? It says Jesus is the image of God. Then all other human beings are made according to the image of God. So if we take a deeply kind of Christological understanding of the image of God, if Jesus is the image of God and all other human beings are made according to that image, then Jesus becomes the paradigmatic figure of what it means for us to be human, right? And so when we see in Jesus' life, his works, his words, his ministry, his love, and his commitment to justice, which is an expression of what love looks like in public, as many others have said, that becomes very significant of what it means to be for others. And so I think by attending to the Jesus tradition, for those of us who or have been shaped by this larger Christian story can go a long way with helping us kind of push back on this individualism, a rugged kind of individualism. For others, I think we just have to continue, as they would say in my kind of religious tradition, we have to continue to bear witness, right? We have to just continue to embody in our practices and verbalize in our words those deepest values that we are committed to. And hopefully something like social conversions can happen at times, right? And that's not just kind of a throwaway in the sense of, oh, well, we just don't have any other sense of recourse. Like, no, I think there's something that's really important about this notion of kind of just continuing to bear witness. And then at points or at times, perhaps there will be kinds of social conversions that we need on that. So Carol, I'm sorry, I probably couldn't say more in that regard.
Thank you.
Yeah, that'll get us started anyway.
Yes, thank you very much, sir.
Sure.
I saw a question come in through the chat box, and I'll say that's an excellent place to ask questions as well. This from Alice Cotton. Would Dr. Smith talk a little about the similarities and differences of the theological beliefs of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and also Dr. Pauli Murray, who is both the civil rights leader and a local figure and even saint in our calendar of the church. Dr. Smith, is that something you could address?
Yeah, I will try to do so. And obviously others, given the context we're in, love for this to be a broader part of the conversation. And I would just say maybe straightforwardly and directly, it's going to be this deep commitment of understanding that, and I referenced this before, and I think is relevant to bring back here in light of this question, that we think about the grace that we have received in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That grace is an expression of God's love towards the larger creation and to every one of us. And then love, as it is extended in public, really has a deep commitment to justice, right? And so, as many others have pointed out, that justice is just what love looks like in public. And for me, I think both Pauli Murray and King, who were situated in this particular, say, tradition, right? Without going into any details right now, this kind of larger kind of Black social gospel tradition with a lot of other resources that were kind of wrapped into this deep commitment that to love others means to be committed and to fight for justice of those who are on the margins, to those who don't present in the same ways as we present, and that this is deeply embedded in the religious life of particular communities. And so I think both of those individuals and the larger communities that they were part of and the larger tradition in which they were a part of in different ways and different expressions need to be affirmed and embraced. And we always need to go back to these voices, right? To see the courage and the insight that they left for us and how we can move forward with in more constructive ways in our own time for greater sense of well-being. But I have deep admiration for both of those individuals while recognizing our faults and foibles, right? And so even when I talk about King, I try to do this, and when I teach this, King was he was a flawed individual, just like all of us are flawed, right? And again, a flawed person trying to love other flawed human beings, no doubt, with flawed methodologies, right? This is our lot. This is all of us as we continue to press in and see what God's grace can unfold in our collective life together.
Who else has a question they'd like to ask? I've got it on gallery view so I can see any raised hands, but also feel free to unmute and go ahead.
Good morning. This is Wes Wasdike. I'm wondering if you could comment on the importance of the Protestant tradition, and especially evangelical Protestantism, with the extreme focus on individual salvation as a source of this extreme individualism in our society?
Yeah, Wes, thank you so much for your question and for all the questions that have come up to this point here. I do think that, and I didn't train as a social scientist, right? So I want to be careful in terms of how definitively certain claims are being made here, but certainly one can see a kind of correlation, right, between in certain, let's say, American evangelical Protestant traditions, this emphasizing that the gospel is really about me and my personal relationship with God, and that the scope of the gospel is really about my individual guilt before God and the need for my guilt to be forgiven to stave off, the wrath of God, this kind of punitive type of relationship, and the overemphasis of Jesus in kind of engagement with the individual. I do think there's a sense in which that emphasis, that focus, that drumbeat that reminds, people in these spaces again and again and again and again that this is about me, right, and my individual relationship with God, can carry over in some unhealthy ways if it's not part of a larger holistic framework. The way I think about the gospel, West, is that we think about, I would say, 2 Corinthians, 5:16-21, about being an ambassador of reconciliation or a ministry of reconciliation, that basically God is reconciling all things through Christ. So this use of all, or pos, right? What does that all entail? Well, the context of, I think, 2 Corinthians is telling us that this is all of God's good creation. And so therefore, if sin, right, has come in as relational brokenness that has broken the various relationships of the world, the relationship of human beings with God, yes, human beings with one another, yes, human beings with themselves, yes, human being with the non-human animal world, yes, and human beings with regard to the environment, yes, and the way human beings arrange their social lives together, right? All of that has been impacted by sin. All of it has. And what I would challenge people to say is that, did any of those things exist before God's good creation? If the answer to that is no, and then the question is, did sin not impact, in terms of relational brokenness, all of those kinds of things? If the answer to that is yes, then when we think about the gospel, a cosmic Christ, one who is reconciling all things, then the gospel scope is for a kind of restoration of the relationships that God deeply desires, for some would call a concept of shalom, right? Of peace, of well-being, of flourishing, of justice, marked by a kind of holism. And so I do, West, I know that others may want to push back on this, and that's fair, right? We always have to listen to various voices. So it's not that the individuals don't matter, but I think an overemphasis or a truncated understanding of the gospel that only focuses on the individual will lead us deeply astray when it comes to some of these other types of concerns and matters that we are talking about here. And also that was in the purview of Dr. King's ethical, political, and theological thinking as well, that characterizes public ministry.
Thank you.
I saw that Mary Schoenfeld had a question, and so we'll move to Mary next, and then I saw a question come in from Sarah Malone in the chat. So Mary, go ahead, and then Sarah will move to you next.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Smith for his presentation, and I'm inspired to read more of Dr. King's writings. My comment or question is, I think the issues of white supremacy and the conflicts that we're dealing with in our society is really a white problem. It's really our problem of what to do about these groups, the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, and do we need to send missionaries to somehow convert them or enlighten them? Not that that wouldn't be a dangerous move, but I'm just thinking that this is something we white Protestants have to address in some way.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mary, for being here and for your comments and your reflection. And that is the challenge, right? You mentioned about the dangerous, a dangerous proposition, right? As you raised it. And it does strike me, just in terms of, the dangerous part, right? That this has been part of Christian tradition, right? Of bearing witness in some really difficult type of circumstances where persecution, oppression are real things, right? I'm not trained as a historian, but I try to read, Christian history and church history, because it reminds me, right? Every time I think that things are really bad now, which I think there are some deep challenges, that, there were times in which it was just as bad, right? Maybe even worse, right? In some respects, but yet God was still faithful, but also that the people of God had to bear witness in those very difficult circumstances. And that's when they had to ask that question, what work is our theology doing for us, if anything at all? And I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves, right? What work is our theology doing for us, if anything at all? And meaning that, yes, there is a kind of discomfort that we will have. Yes, there is a kind of danger that will take place with bearing witness to the gospel. And in some ways, yes, I do think that some religious communities, right, in the United States, right, our Christian communities have at times been ostracized and marginalized in different ways. But I also think that there's quite a bit of privilege and power and resources, right, that Christianity in America wields, that one has to be very, very careful of. And I've had to wrestle with this as well, Mary, that what would it look like to begin to think about raising up missionaries to turn itself back on certain expressions of Christian nationalism, right? Because I don't think that Christian nationalism is going to be in keeping with the Jesus tradition. That's the judgment that I'm making in terms of my understanding of Christianity, my understanding of those commitments and what that means. And so will the church, the authentic church, right, have the courage to stand up and to proclaim against these various expressions of Christian nationalism, in terms of like a deep type of as a missiological engagement? I do think the witness of the church rests upon this in different ways. So, Mary, I think your point is well taken. In some ways, it's outside of my purview to prescribe exactly what that would look like or what that would be. But I take your point, and I think it's very well stated and something we have to wrestle with and think about.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Here's the question from Sarah Malone. How can Dr. King's message of agape and beloved community be brought into the 21st century to help facilitate the current social justice movement for millennials and Gen Z folks who don't remember the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, but want to be active in the current struggle?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question, Sarah. And I think in many ways that even though people, obviously, or some of them may not be familiar with all of what was going on in terms of the civil rights movement, there are some who say that these movements are not your grandmother's civil rights movement, and so on and so forth. I actually see a kind of continuity between these times. I actually think the underlying kind of imagination of the way we think about our larger political and social life together has remained, but it just evolves in different ways. And so I think where King can maybe help us, at least in our contemporary setting, is this, that first of all, let me put it this way, that if we want to leverage King for our contemporary setting, I think we have to do what many like womanist ethicists who are kind of Black women who are writing in theology and ethics rightly remind us of, that we have to think with King and perhaps against King for a constructive King, right? And so what that means is that King had resources, right, that were internal to what he was thinking about, but yes, he used a lot of masculine language that is very off-putting, especially when women were so marginalized. At times, many instances, women who were the primary drivers of the civil rights movement, those who were doing the majority of the work and making things happen, were not given their due recognition. The leadership insights of key figures were often minimized and marginalized in ways that were absolutely unhelpful. The way we think about love as agape needs to be informed by a kind of eros love, which is a more embodied love. So some would say that agape is more abstracted, but eros reminds us of an kind of an embodied love as we kind of bump into each other, that reminds us of these lived material conditions. So the first thing I would say is that we have to begin to think with King, against King, meaning that the internal resources that were already there that could reaffirm these places where there were blind spots, right? But then also another step, King would talk about being maladjusted, right? He says, look, we have to be maladjusted to injustice. And I do think the younger generation now, I'm really excited about some of the things that I'm seeing, because many of them, not all, many of them want to be maladjusted to injustice. And so what does a transformed nonconformity look like? And this is where I think King can help in terms of a transformed nonconformity. So nonconformity to some of these social ills, but yet it's transformed in particular ways. So the question is, what are those resources that are transforming that for us? And so when we think about leveraging King for our contemporary moment, I think we've got to really trace out the implications of King's philosophy of nonviolence and love and justice in the realms in which King took it that ultimately people resisted. Just talking about the dignity of Black folks, okay, we can just affirm that in lip service. But when you start really talking about questions of economic injustice, questions of militarism, and the kind of political marginalization that controls all types of resources, that's a whole different ballgame. And I would say that for today, if we want to leverage the resources of King, we've got to have the courage of our convictions to go where this collective set of convictions would ultimately go. And that would be questions of economic justice and questions of political enfranchisement. But that's going to require a kind of reckoning with a past through some deep measures of redress, right, of correction. And I'll just say this, Sarah, to your very, very good question, that, many people will look at King, yes, as amongst other things, as a theologian of reconciliation. But I think King would certainly affirm, especially when you look at his corpus, that he would say you can't have reconciliation without reparation. And what I mean by reparation is not just like giving money, right? I'm not talking about only that. Reparation meaning that you've got to figure out what is the problem that separated folks, right? How do you begin to repair and redress those deep harms? And then, and only then, maybe can we talk about questions of reconciliation. But one of the fundamental challenges that we will have is that if we try to get to reconciliation without some type of repair of what has gone wrong, then I think those kind of projects are doomed to failure. So that's what I would say in terms of how do we leverage King for today, thinking with King, against King, appropriating these resources, and then tracing out the full implications of King's thought for many of the sacred cows that a lot of times we dare not touch.
So I mentioned this in the chat box and hope you all were able to see it, but Dr. Smith has graciously agreed to stick around until 11:30. So we've got about 5 minutes left for any who might like to get a question in. I think I saw one come in from Barb Ashdown. Barb, would you be able to unmute and say a little bit more about what's on your mind? And if there's a question in there, just let us know. You're muted, Barb, if you'll unmute, but we can see you.
Yeah, it's too bad. Too bad you can see me. Let's see. Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
What I put in the chat was our church has in the past been in relationship with Black churches in our community. And we are trying to reignite these relationships, and they are being resisted, particularly by church leadership. And we know from having talked to parishioners in these churches that they're very interested in developing more relationship with us. So I guess I'm seeking ideas or thoughts about how we might approach this. Our clergy has tried to approach this somewhat, and maybe more ideas of how our members, parishioners can approach this. Because I know there's openness to this at the level of individual members.
Mhm. Very good. Thank you so much, Barb, in your question here. And just so I'm clear, when you say that church leadership resisting, you mean some of the Black church leadership is resisting
The pastors.
Yeah, of the Black churches, right? Is that
Right.
okay? Yeah,
And
gotcha.
I don't want to name any particular ones, but
Sure,
that's
sure.
the level that
Yeah.
have been more resistant. And, based on concern about the relationship between white people and Black people and all this, and privilege and everything, I can understand resistance.
Yeah.
I understand that. So part of it is how do we start developing, reigniting these kinds of relationships in our community with our churches, our Christian churches.
Yeah, no, thank you, Barb. These are absolutely challenging questions, and thank you for raising this. And it's something certainly on the minds of so many people. And in terms of leadership of various churches, I think that this is where we have to have a deep historical memory, right? To recognize that the moment where we are and the kind of resistance does not kind of emerge out of a vacuum, right? That there is a kind of a cultural memory that people have. And so I think, and I can't speak for these leaders because I'm not sure who they are, what their reasoning is, but in general, I do know that there are many who are deeply critical because they've been here before. So when I was a kid, we used to watch the Peanuts specials, the Charlie Brown, right? Some of you may remember that. As a kid, I used to watch the specials when they would come on TV and try to turn when people would actually get newspapers, right? Turn to the comics. And so you had with Charlie Brown, Lucy holding the football, right? And then, he would try to kick it. She would move the football, and Charlie Brown, boom, falls on his back, right? And then you'll see an episode and something happens and you're thinking, maybe this time, maybe. And then you get close and it's like something has changed. And boop, she pulls the football back again and Charlie Brown falls down on his face, right? And so for many people, rightly or wrongly, right, they feel like, look, we've been down this road before. And what they are concerned about is not so much just trying to think about getting together in terms of meeting together and feeling good about, being in the same space. But what some of these leaders are concerned about, and again, I'm not speaking for these particular leaders that you were referring to, again, because I don't know, nor have I taught with them, but generally speaking, pulling back some, for some, they're more concerned about, okay, our physical well-being, kind of political disenfranchisement. It's like for some of them, they just don't have time to just meet so we can feel better about ourselves because they're seeing the lived, embodied material conditions of people that are still detrimental to forms of human flourishing. And so they have, tried to focus on a different type of engagement. Again, that's deeply challenging. So what I would say on the part of those other churches and denominations, organizations who want to reach out is to have a deep sense of patience, right? To just say, look, we're going to stay committed to this. We're not going to take offense, right, at this as an expression of love, right, of agape love, a disinterested love of neighbor for their own sakes, that the love that we're committed to is not based on a kind of reciprocity that they have to reciprocate, right? So again, if we're leveraging King's resources, some of this comes into place. And what happens is that oftentimes when people see a kind of commitment, a kind of resilience, a kind of scenario where, look, we're committed to this for the long haul, that we're not just going to kind of cut bait and run when things become difficult, this can go some ways into establishing a kind of trustworthiness that comes along with these issues once again. Now, if there are individuals, obviously individuals as neighbors, we get together, we can, commit to different kinds of things. And I would say as a church community to try to get a sense of what are those things that are deeply concerning to those particular communities there. And even if we're not in partnership or in the same spaces, how can we as a community utilize the resources that we have with the commitments we have to these questions of justice, work on behalf of them, even if they don't know that we're doing this or don't want to directly partner with us in this regard. This is what I think it means to express agape, right? And love. And it hurts, right? That we can't come together with all of the resources that we say that we have in the Christian tradition. Why is it that so many of our programs of racial reconciliation have been unsustainable, right? It's lamentable. It really, really is. And it hurts because it seems like we should be able to do better. But there's a history here that we have to reckon with in terms of the complicit role that certain forms of American Christianity have played in perpetuating and maintaining racial justice. And we've just got to figure out ways in all of its messiness and weightiness and woundedness, right, to continue to persevere through this. So Barbara, I'm sorry I couldn't be more concrete than that, but these are just some general ways of thinking about these issues. But I would encourage you to stay the course and to work hard, as much as it's really difficult for us to do, all of us to do, is not take offense, right, but to recognize that this process is going to be long and arduous. And I'll just end with this, and because I do want to take maybe the last question that was on there, but I heard a political commentator say something like, doing this kind of work is going to be like running a marathon through mud. Right now, a marathon is going to be long enough, right? 26 miles, like, man, that's just hard. But now when you got to run that marathon through mud, it's just an added layer of difficulty and dimension to it, right? And I do think something like that is at work. But I will say, in terms of hopefully an encouraging note, this is what Jeremiah 29, I think, is getting at for me, this letter to the exiles, right? The prophet Jeremiah talks about seek the peace or the shalom, the well-being, the flourishing of the city, pray for it, right? And it's really interesting, right? Because there's this notion of a kind of presence that needs to be there. In other words, this is where you are, but it's not really your home, right? So you have to have a kind of presence with a critical distance. It says, pray for the city, right? But then also seek its peace, its well-being. And so you have various notions. You have prophetic presence in those verses there. You've got prophetic prayer. You've got a commitment to prophetic peace. Then you also have a notion of prophetic patience, right? Because what does it say that the false prophets were telling the people of God who have been displaced from their land? Oh, well, it's going to be over soon. Everything is going to be restored. Basically, God was telling the prophets to say, no, that's a false prophecy. You're going to be here for a while. So settle in and settle down, right? And lean in and get ready. That's what the message was, right? And then what did it say in verse 11, I believe? It says, I have a purpose and plan for you for a hope and a future. And that's where the prophetic hope comes in, right? That even though we need a kind of prophetic patience that is steadily engaging, but we also have to have a prophetic hope that God has promised that there will be a kind of restoration that is going to take place, even if we're not sure exactly what that restoration will look like. And that's what keeps us going. And the very last point, I would say, and this is when I think about the Day of Days, Reverend Philip, that you raised earlier. Remember the Montgomery bus boycott? It went over a calendar year. And so you got to think about that. After the first week, it's like, oh, this is interesting. Okay, after the first month, okay. 6 months, change still hasn't come, right? We've been doing this for 6 months. Dude, what is this about, right? 10 months, right?
Yeah.
year, and then after a year, right? And then the change came, right? But yet there was this, so the prophetic patience is not an apathetic way of approaching it, like, well, we just don't know, we're just going to sit and wait. It was always an active engagement, foot on the accelerator the whole time, but recognizing that we got a lot of work to do. So,
Right.
yeah.
And that totally, this is kind of just summarizing King's philosophy and Christianity in what you're saying about the way we need to pursue this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think so.
Thank you
I
so
think
much.
so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Reverend Philip, I thought I saw,
Yeah.
and I didn't get a chance to read it. I thought it was maybe one
Yeah.
more question that came in, and because I went
Yeah.
along on that response to Barb, but I do want to honor the
Of course, yeah.
questions.
If you've got a moment, we'll take a
Or
few
two
more
more.
moments to answer this one. This is from Lila Wolf, and this will be our last question. So Lila, you got it in. Well done. What did Dr. King say about stewardship, and what organizations are most effective in making a more just society, such as NAACP, SPLC, EJI, etc.?
Yeah. So in terms of stewardship, and I would love to see if I can get a little bit more clarification on exactly what is meant by the notion of stewardship in Lila's question here. But I do want to say something about the second part of our most effective, or what organization is most effective in making a more just society. So I actually think that there are many, too many to name, right? And all of these organizations have their faults, but they also have their deep benefits. And they also have people who are fully committed to the work, and people who may engage in the work for a time and then kind of fall back. I do think organizations and institutions across the board are going to be really important, because organizations bring certain people together. Institutions, when they're created, not only preserve values, but they transmit values from one generation to the next, so that there can be a continuity in the work. And so I think institutions become really important. Organizations that gather resources, that bring human resources together, but then also various material resources can help in different ways. I am a huge advocate of working from below and above, right? So I think we have to look on the ground, engage in forms of community justice. What does justice look like in the particular community in which we find ourselves, right? And what are the organizations that can help to those ends? We have to be very careful of, so I think national organizations are really important, right? And they do engage at times federal policies, right, and larger national movements. But you can't have just national organizations without having localized organizations, because localized organizations, according to forms of community justice, help us identify what are the existing injustices in the community, and what do we need to do at the localized level to go from states of affairs that are marked by injustice to greater forms of justice. But that's localized, right? Because the prescription in another place that may have a different set of circumstances, the move towards justice in those areas, in those spaces, may look very differently. And so what I would say that for any of these organizations, from a Christian perspective, right, my own Christian perspective, if it's guided by this broader vision of shalom, right, of well-being, of flourishing, of peace at the various levels, any organizations that are committed to those kinds of things, then that becomes a moral vision that can help guide the moves. So I do think organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative, which I have some friends who are there, deeply appreciate their work. I try to support their work in very minimal ways. I need to do more in terms of various ways of supporting Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. Grew up about 40 minutes from Montgomery, so a lot of the things that they deal with are very familiar in terms of my background, upbringing. The NAACP obviously has produced some just giants of people who were really leaning in, doing good work, in so many other organizations, and other organizations that aren't led by people of color who are committed to the work of racial and economic justice. So that's kind of what I would say, to just find out and identify who is doing what at the localized level. And if you feel that you can be committed to the things that they're committed to, even if not all the way, kind of down the board, but at least the outcome of the values. And if it doesn't compromise one's convictions too deeply, to join in ways to work together, to try to work for a beloved community that King talked about, and so many others as well.
Excellent answers. Thank you, Dr. Smith, so much for coming and then sticking around a little bit more on this kind of snowy, sleety morning. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us. I hope that all of you here will join with some virtual applause for Dr. Smith. And as so many of his answers indicated, there's so much more to think about and to do. And so we'll keep talking about King and his legacy and other avenues and figures in Black theology in the coming weeks. So we hope that you all will join us for those sessions. But for now, once again, thank you so much, Dr. Smith. Wonderful to see you, to have you with us. And we'll look forward to seeing and hearing more of your work in various forms going forward. Thank you so much.
I am so grateful for you for inviting me in this space. Thank all of you for being here, for your wonderful questions, and for giving me a hearing. I know these matters aren't easy, and I am deeply grateful to your generosity of spirit to me in this space. And go in peace.